She was a single mother expecting her third child.
She was real happy. She was already making plans.
She was able to acquire the new home.
And this time, she knew she'd found the right partner.
He cared for her son.
He was an upstanding pillar of the community.
Any problems or needs, he's the guy.
But then 3 gunshots leave her clinging to life.
She was very gravely injured.
There was hope that she could push through.
Can you hear me?
It has all the markings of a hate crime.
The letters KKK was spray painted in multiple places.
This is certainly a targeted attack.
Until detectives uncover a shocking motive for murder.
It didn't make sense.
Something so violent doesn't sit right.
Whoever did this was trying to create confusion.
October 13th, 2020. It's just after midnight in Chicago, Illinois, a Midwest metropolis of nearly 10 million.
The city certainly is rich in history, from its architecture to its location. It has the lake, it has skyscrapers.
Even though Chicago is a world-class city, you can very clearly at times see the racial and economical divide of the city.
The reality is there is a lot of crime that happens here in Chicago.
In response, the city has turned to what's known as ShotSpotter.
ShotSpotter technology is an acoustic, sound-driven device that alerts police before a 911 call can even be placed.
Once shots are reported, Chicago police act based on the information that they receive.
It's always listening, always ready the moment trouble arises. And at 12:06 a.m., the ShotSpotter system alerts dispatch of several gunshots in the Jeffrey Manor neighborhood.
Jeffrey Manor is a community on the south side of Chicago off of 95th Street. It's a quiet community.
There's relatively not a lot of crime.
1064, officer response needed to the area of 95th Street. ShotSpotter alert.
10-4, badge 2366 en route.
First responders immediately rush to the scene.
When they arrived, there was a female laying face down outside of a residence.
She had been shot and was fighting for her life.
We still got a pulse.
And it's not just her life on the line.
This woman is maybe 8 months pregnant.
Ma'am, can you hear me?
But as long as she is breathing, there's hope that she and her unborn baby can survive.
Need medical, multiple gunshot wounds.
Number one duty of the police officer is to render aid.
Stay with me now. Can you tell me your name?
She is still conscious enough to give the police her name.
Stacy.
35-year-old Stacy Jones was a single mother of 2 boys when she first moved to Chicago from Tennessee.
She wanted a better life for her children.
She had goals, and she just wanted the best for everybody.
She found a home in the Jeffrey Manor community, which was a big positive for her. She had gotten exactly what she needed in order to raise her small family.
Chicago also came with a built-in support network.
Her mother's family was from Chicago.
They all helped out because they were so close.
Hey, cut over here? Yeah, that's perfectly fine.
Transitioning from Tennessee to a big city like Chicago, community and relationships are going to be important.
The big move also came with more financial stability.
Stacy Jones was a probation officer.
She had been part of the law enforcement family for many, many years.
Prior to her move, she accepted a position with Cook County.
Probation officer paid a little bit more here than in Tennessee. That's why she went to Chicago.
Once settled, Stacy made sure her sons thrived in the Windy City.
She was a good mother to both of them. She put out 100%. And when they got older, she had them in football, baseball, and karate, so she kept them busy.
Hey, Mom, how's it going?
And through her son's time on the football team, Stacy found some excitement of her own.
Your son, he's a natural. Does he practice at home with Dad?
Nah, he ain't around.
Her son's coach was 39-year-old Corey Deering, a pillar of the community.
He was well known in the neighborhood for his longtime volunteer work with kids, as well as his career with the Parks Department.
He helped her son develop his skills in football, and he seemed to have enjoyed playing the sport.
And with each practice, Stacy found herself more and more drawn to him.
There's a level of trust that she developed with Deering because he cared for her son.
But I see how good you are with these kids, though.
Yeah, these kids, they bring me joy.
This was someone that she began to like.
For Corey, the attraction was mutual.
At some point, their relationship became close, and they began a romantic relationship.
They quickly fell in love.
Within months of meeting, Stacy got a happy surprise when she found out she was expecting a new baby.
And when she learned it was going to be another boy, she was even more excited.
Over the next several months, Stacy wasted no time getting prepared for her new arrival.
She was real happy. She was already making plans. She was ready for him.
But now, just a month before her baby is due, police have discovered Stacy lying outside of her home after the Chicago ShotSpotter system detected gunshots in the area.
She was very gravely injured. She sustained 3 gunshot wounds to the back.
Can you hear me?
But she was still breathing.
There was hope that she could push through this.
But it's also what's around Stacy's body that officers find particularly alarming.
There's fresh graffiti at the scene.
The letters KKK was spray painted in multiple places on the home.
35-year-old Stacy Jones was excited to welcome a new baby into her growing family with Coach Corey Deering.
She had found out that it was a boy, so it wasn't like she didn't have experience raising these little boys.
She was happy. She made me proud. And was gonna be a good mother of 3.
But now, just a month from her due date, Chicago police have found Stacy shot multiple times outside her home and racial slurs spray painted on the outside of her house.
When you have something so violent happen to a woman 8 months pregnant, it just doesn't sit right.
But she was alive.
We still got a pulse.
While paramedics begin to work on Stacy, responding officers clear the house.
They make a terrible discovery inside.
Her 11 and 7-year-old sons were in the house when their mother's gunned down on the porch.
Thankfully, they were unharmed, and both were asleep during the incident.
To be one moment sleeping soundly in your bed, to be awakened by sirens, I can't even imagine what those children were going through.
The officers contact one of Stacy's cousins to come pick up the children, while paramedics transport Stacy to the hospital.
As they're preparing for the ambulance, though, something falls from her pajamas.
It was a 9mm pistol.
We have a woman with a weapon in her waistband.
This certainly raised suspicion that Stacy Jones expected that something was going to happen.
Could that also mean she knew the attacker?
As EMTs rush Stacy to the hospital, major crimes detectives arrive and begin examining the scene.
What do we have, officer?
Stacy had been found shot in the back and was lying on her side, so it's apparent she turned away from her attacker.
So it would indicate to me one of 2 things. One, that she was either retreating in an urgent manner just to get away, or that she had completely let her guard down.
Detectives discover 3 shell casings by the door, as well as a small pool of blood.
Which means this is likely where the shooting occurred.
There is also derogatory graffiti plastered around the scene.
There's a racial slur.
Police immediately began their investigation. wondering whether or not a hate crime was involved.
But given the nature of the neighborhood, detectives are skeptical.
The neighborhood is predominantly African American and Hispanic.
It's a tight-knit community, so most of the people that stay in Jeffrey Manor know the ins and outs of Jeffrey Manor.
It's known as the Jeffrey Manor Maze. It'd be very difficult to do like a drive-by shooting per se.
This is not typically an area where white supremacists or racists would ply their trade, as it were.
Those sorts of racial tensions usually occur in areas where minorities are new arrivals rather than established residents.
It didn't make sense.
So it's clear that whoever did this was trying to initially throw the police off or kind of create confusion into the scene.
Still, the fact that Stacy took the time to get her own gun seems to indicate she was expecting trouble.
This is certainly a targeted attack.
But even though she had a weapon, Stacy had been shot in the back.
That suggests, obviously, somebody would have been retreating from a threat.
Was it immediately confrontational, or was it a conversation? Did her guard get let down?
When the detectives run Stacy's name, they realize that she may have had an extra reason to be wary of late-night visitors.
They find out that she's a probation officer.
Naturally, you want to think, does someone have angst against her directly based on her profession?
She's part of the law enforcement family, and everybody that puts on that badge understands that keep an eye out for yourself.
Maybe the shooter was a convicted felon out on probation, or the relative of an inmate whose probation had been revoked.
Hoping someone might have witnessed something, detectives canvass Stacy's neighbors.
Most homes these days use some sort of Ring camera or a camera that records the outside of what's going on.
We'd like to ask you some questions about the shooting that happened across the street.
Honestly, I ain't hear nothing. I was asleep.
Well, I noticed you do have a security camera.
Do you mind sharing that footage with us?
Yeah, no problem.
Great. Here's our card. Go ahead and send it to us on that email address right there. All right, thank you, sir.
When Stacy's cousin arrives to pick up the boys, she also agrees to speak with detectives.
That's the first line of inquiry. Who would want to harm this person? That they would have the nerve to come to her residence and gun her down.
Are you aware if Stacy had any enemies?
No. She was very well loved by everybody.
Her cousin doesn't know of anybody who would want to harm Stacy.
What about the father of her baby?
Obviously, people were aware she was 8 months pregnant.
To be honest, she never told me the name of her baby's father.
She was very private for, as it turns out, maybe some obvious reasons.
But I do know that he was married, though.
Stacy Jones's cousin has just told detectives investigating the shooting that left the young mother of 2 fighting for her life that she believes Stacy was dating a married man.
Could that have something to do with the shooting?
She was potentially breaking up a family, right?
I wish I knew more. Sorry.
Thanks. We're gonna head to the hospital.
We'll let you know if we have more questions, okay?
Unfortunately, Stacy won't be able to provide the detectives with any more information either.
When the detectives arrived at the hospital, they were greeted with bittersweet news.
The good part about it was they were able to deliver the baby alive.
He was delivered in critical condition.
My grandson, they're transferring him now. But it's bad.
There, he could receive proper neonatal care in the hopes that he could survive.
However, the doctors are unable to save his mother's life.
Stacy. Baby. They said there was nothing they could do.
Unfortunately, the injury was just too severe. she didn't survive.
Stacy's family is devastated by the outcome.
When I found out, I started crying. It was hard.
You lose a loved one, someone that is that person that you lean on and depend on, then all of a sudden it abruptly ends. It's unfair, it's not right.
After giving Stacy's mother a moment to compose herself, detectives ask if she'd be willing to answer a few more questions.
We want to know about the domestic relationships.
The sooner interviews take place, the more critical the responses.
Detectives start by asking if she can think of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Stacy.
No, no one. It doesn't make any sense.
She was a loving person. Not just me and the mother and children, to everybody.
To think somebody would be able to do this to a very visibly third trimester, not just woman, but a human being, was almost unimaginable.
Her mother is also unaware of any issues at Stacy's work.
No, she works so hard for those people.
She was dedicated to where she worked. She had a criminal justice degree. She had a master's degree, forensic, and she was going on to get a doctorate in forensic science.
Her hard work made her well-loved by coworkers as well as clients.
Stacy chose a career where she's a probationary officer, and most people would think that that's a dangerous job, and it can be at times, but oftentimes probation officers will begin to, in some ways, develop a relationship, trying to make sure that they see the best for that individual so that they don't have to see them again.
Detectives then move on to the topic of the father of Stacy's baby.
Obviously, people were aware she's pregnant, but she was very private about who the father was.
In fact, the family didn't even know his name.
After wrapping up with Stacy's mother, detectives head back to the station, where they learn the footage from Stacy's neighbor has come in.
It was grainy at first, but it really created a clear-cut picture about what happened that night.
The video reveals a silver SUV approaching Stacy's house and then driving slowly past.
More importantly, they were able to get the license plate.
A moment later, a man enters the frame.
Although they could not see the face of the individual, one of the things that they saw was a sweatshirt with a very distinctive symbol on it.
He seemed suspicious as he approaches Stacy's house, shining a flashlight into the windows.
After the man knocks on the door, detectives watch as Stacy peers out one of the windows.
She obviously recognizes him and opens her door.
The two of them have a brief conversation outside.
Then she turned her back to go back into the home when she was shot.
He took the time to spray KKK at the scene.
At that point, the man runs.
But it's clear that Stacy never reaches for her own weapon.
There's no evidence to show that she felt so uncomfortable that she wanted to retrieve it. Matter of fact, she was so comfortable that she turned her back on the attacker because she didn't feel like her life was in danger.
But it's still not clear if the man was the father of her baby or just an angry parolee. It could have been anyone.
Hoping to learn more, detectives head to the probation office where Stacy worked.
They're greeted by one of Stacy's coworkers.
Hi there.
And she says she's willing to talk to them.
Do you have a few minutes to speak to us about Stacy?
Oh, of course. Anything I can do to help.
Detectives start by asking her coworker if she knows of any parolees that Stacy might have had issues with.
They'd asked if maybe it was someone that she'd sent back to jail, or maybe a family member of someone.
Oh, not Stacy. I mean, Stacy got along with everyone. And I'm pretty sure that if there was an issue or a problem, she would let me know.
That's when the police learned that the coworker was also one of Stacy's closest friends.
Do you know anything about the father of her child? Anything you can tell us?
Actually, yes.
She was able to shed even more light on the person that she was pregnant with.
And I do know that his first name was Corey.
She knew his name was Corey. She wasn't aware of his last name.
He was Stacy's son's football coach.
But she also knew that the situation with Corey wasn't as rosy as one might think.
Stacy had recently hinted that they were having trouble.
She told law enforcement that he was unhappy with the pregnancy.
As a matter of fact, he told her to get an abortion.
Detectives investigating the murder of Stacy Jones have just learned that the father of her child was less than thrilled about her pregnancy.
There's that opportunity of him being found out by his wife in particular. That certainly is, unfortunately, motives that we've seen in the past.
Detectives ask Stacy's coworker about Stacy and Corey's dating history.
She said that Stacy and Coach Corey had started to date at the beginning of the year, and she was pregnant within a few months.
She said that Corey said that he was afraid of how the baby was going to affect his marriage.
He was pressuring her to have an abortion.
But Stacy refused, and eventually she and Corey broke things off.
The coworker said that Stacy thought that would be the end of it.
She's already a single mother. She's raising 2 boys, and she's got a job. Even if the father wasn't going to be involved, she appeared to be very confident that her baby was going to be just fine.
And then it got really ugly. He began to threaten her.
The further that Stacy got along in her pregnancy, the more upset he got and the more threats Stacy began to receive.
And there was one threat that stood out in particular.
Corey told Stacy that she would never make it to the end of the pregnancy.
It was obvious that she was afraid, even though she tried to hide it.
As time went on, she appeared to let her guard down, almost as if to say, well, I'm nearing the end, so maybe the threat has been alleviated.
She says Stacy had become confident enough to go on the offensive herself.
She started an investigation into Corey and into his background in the efforts to be able to collect child support.
She wanted him to take some financial responsibility.
Now, was Corey aware that she was going to file child support?
I'm not sure.
This was turning out to not only be a threat to his marriage, but his finances as well, which could be a huge motivating factor.
But was that enough to push him to murder? Back at the station, detectives look into Corey, starting with his last name.
That's presumably not going to be that hard to find the coach of the youth football team.
And sure enough, they quickly get a hit. 39-year-old Corey Deering.
Not only is he a football coach, he actually works for the Park District. There's an office there at the local park. He is the person that's called on by people who frequent the park. Any problems or needs that they have, he's the guy.
Corey had been in the district for more than a decade.
He was a trusted and respected member of the community.
He had no criminal background.
But just because Corey doesn't have a rap sheet doesn't mean he hasn't dealt with legal trouble.
As the police began to do a deeper dive, they find out that Corey has other court cases pending against him. And for not 1, not 2, but 5 other custody and child support cases from 5 different women.
Stacy's not the only woman that's out here that is in this relationship with this married man. What's going on with this brother?
It's clear that Corey is no stranger to the situation he was in with Stacy.
So this caused the police to think that if he's had 5 other custody cases and paternity cases pending, why Stacy? Why now?
It's something police want to ask Corey himself.
They went over to the Park District building in order to speak to Corey.
We'd like to ask you some questions about Stacy Jones.
Right at the start of the conversation, Corey confirms he's known Stacy since the previous summer and that her son plays on his youth football team.
When they pressed him on the depths of his relationship with Stacy, he was very upfront.
He openly admitted that him and Stacy had been in a relationship and that the relationship had started fairly quickly after she had moved to Chicago.
Beyond that, Mr. Deering also told police that he knew she was pregnant.
Yeah, I'm also pretty sure I'm the father.
How do you feel about that?
I mean, it's not ideal, right?
He said that he respected the fact that Stacy decided to keep the baby.
He had no plans to be involved in the child's life, but he had no issue with Stacy Jones.
I mean, this isn't the first time I've been in a situation like this, you know?
Corey tells detectives that he and Stacy did break things off, but remained cordial.
But he also told police he hadn't spoken to Stacy since July.
At that point, detectives reveal that Stacy is dead, and her newborn son is in critical condition.
But he was just taken aback that he would at all be a suspect because, as he told the police, he had not talked to her in months.
So detectives asked Corey where he was the night of the shooting.
He says he was home with his wife and his son, just doing some stuff in the garage.
His hobby was fitness, and he worked out a lot.
I was in the garage working out, and my son was there for a while. He eventually went inside.
He said his family could confirm his alibi.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Detectives are still suspicious of Corey, but since they don't have anything to bring him in on, they're forced to leave.
But they promise they'll be in touch.
After talking to Corey, the detectives subpoena his phone records.
They also learned that the trace on the SUV's license plate had come back.
And much to their surprise, the license plate does not actually come back to Corey Deering.
The owner of the car was a person by the name of Alicia Wyatt.
Chicago detectives have just learned that the SUV caught on security video the night of Stacy Jones's murder is registered to a woman named Alicia Wyatt.
The police are stunned. Who is Alicia Wyatt? Given the nature of Stacy's job, is she someone that was a client, a parolee?
Or was she related to someone who was?
While police are dispatched to find Alicia Wyatt,
Got the records?
detectives dig deeper into Stacy's case files.
They don't find any parolees with the last name Wyatt, or anyone listing her as a contact.
So now the police are really trying to figure out how these two women are connected.
Detectives also reach back out to Stacy's coworker, who says the name doesn't sound familiar.
The only option detectives have at this point was to follow up on Corey's alibi.
Police went to speak to Corey's wife.
Do you know a woman named Stacy Jones?
Who? Corey's wife immediately denies any knowledge of anyone named Stacy Jones.
No, but I wouldn't be surprised whoever she is if she's pregnant.
Why do you say that?
Whether she wasn't familiar with Stacy, but she still knew that her man was cheating on her.
Because according to her, this isn't the first time it's happened.
She knew this guy had multiple women. She even told him, like, I'm familiar with this lifestyle that he has. So was it love? Was the financial gain? What was it that was keeping her there with Corey?
Do you think Corey's capable of murder?
Corey? No. He's never been violent with anyone else that I know of.
He had other children with women who were not his wife. There was no evidence they ever attempted to harm those women, attempted to threaten them so that they would not have these children. So it is curious as to why Stacy Jones having his child would be the trigger for him.
Corey's wife also confirms his alibi.
She indicated to them that on the night of the shooting, he had been at home in the garage, both working on a vehicle and also working out. This was something that Corey did on a daily basis.
And our son was out there most of the evening with him.
According to Corey's wife, their son came back inside and got ready for bed around 10:30.
She said she went to bed around then as well, but the garage light was still on.
Do you mind if we see this garage?
Sure. This way.
Before leaving, Detectives take a look around the garage.
As expected, there's a home gym and a workshop area.
But that's not all detectives find.
Upon searching the garage, they found cans of white spray paint.
Given the graffiti at the crime scene, this grabbed detectives' attention.
The stuff belonged to Corey?
Actually, all that paint is mine. I use it for screen printing.
Corey Deering's wife told him that she used the spray paint in order to do screen printing of t-shirts and that Corey would help her with that from time to time.
So was it the same paint or just a coincidence?
Detectives wrap up at Corey's house. But when they return to the station, it's to sad news.
Homicide.
Stacy's baby didn't make it.
The young boy did survive for only 4 days.
He was on the life reserve, but they told him even if he lived, he'd never be no good. So they made the decision to take him off life preserve. It was rough.
The baby succumbed to the injuries, not from the shooting, but from the lack of oxygen received because of the condition of its mother when its mother was killed.
So now, as far as from the police standpoint, it's become a double homicide investigation.
But was Corey the killer?
Detectives get some more insight when they finally receive his cell phone records.
It's not about what they find, but what they don't find.
There's no activity on the phone between 10:30 p.m. and 1 a.m., which would have been around the time of Stacy's murder.
Usually when you have cell phones, they're able to ping off of different cell towers to kind of outline where you are in the area or even to show that the phone was in use. What stood out to the police in this moment was that there was no activity whatsoever.
But at 1 a.m., he suddenly places a single phone call.
He placed a call to Alicia Wyatt.
We got him.
Detectives investigating the murders of Stacy Jones and her newborn child have just uncovered tangible evidence connecting her ex-boyfriend, 39-year-old Corey Deering, to the shooting.
On the night of the shooting, Corey Deering had called Alicia Wyatt.
Alicia was the owner of the SUV seen riding past Stacy's house before the shooting.
And when the detectives finally sit down with Alicia, they learn that the phone call isn't the only thing connecting her to Corey.
She's currently pregnant by Corey as well.
Convinced that Alicia must know something about Stacy's murder, they press her to tell them what happened that night.
It doesn't take long for her to fold.
It's true, Corey did call me that night.
According to Alicia Wyatt, on the night of the shooting, Corey Deering had asked her to come pick him up from the alley outside of his home where he was working out.
Give me your phone.
What for?
Does it matter?
Corey took her cell phone as well as his own and left it in the area of where his home was.
He was aware of cell phone triangulations, so he did not take these cell phones to the vicinity of the crime that he obviously had premeditated.
Then Alicia says Corey instructed her to drive to a neighborhood she'd never been to.
Alicia doesn't ask a lot of questions. This is her man, she trusts him.
According to Alicia, at some point Corey told her to stop and he got out of the vehicle.
Just wait right here.
Corey goes around the corner. She's not privy to see what has happened, but what she can say has happened is that during his absence, she's heard gunshots ring out.
And then he came back a few minutes later out of breath. What happened?
Drive up the block.
He instructed her to drive to a different area where he got out of the car again and finally came back to the car the second time, panting and sweating.
When he returned to the vehicle, he was very stoic.
Shortly thereafter, they leave. the scene.
Alicia says she dropped him off. He gave her back her phone and then called her a bit later after she returned home.
Then I heard about the murder on the news and I recognized the house and I didn't know what to do.
Alicia suspected that Corey was involved in something, although she never asked him what he did, and she never actually saw him do anything. She was afraid for her own safety.
And you didn't know what his plans were?
No, I swear I had no clue what he was doing.
Ultimately, detectives believe her. They think she really had no idea what Corey was going to do.
So they let her go.
Her statements were very consistent with what was known at the time. She was, police believe, a pawn.
But her statement is enough to get an arrest warrant for Corey.
Corey was charged with at least 2 counts of first-degree murder, both for Stacy Jones and for the child that was born and lived for 4 days.
Once he's arrested, Corey refuses to speak to police.
But Corey's lack of cooperation hardly matters once detectives are able to confiscate his phone.
Apparently, Corey liked to record his workouts, even one from the night of the murder.
During the recording of the workout, he had on a certain sweatshirt that had a certain distinct marking on it, consistent with the distinct marking that they saw on the individual who shot Stacy Jones.
I guess the idea is to show that he's, hey, I'm at my garage working and nowhere near the crime scene, but you forgot to take off a very descriptive sweatshirt.
And on June 6, 2023, the case goes to trial.
On the one side, you have the prosecution who has said that, yes, this man was a philanderer. Yes, he stepped outside of his marriage, but this baby was one baby too many.
Why don't you just come out and talk to me?
Listen, I've already told you, there's nothing you can say that's gonna convince me to change my mind.
What about me? What about my family?
What about me? What about this baby?
And as soon as Stacy turned her back, Corey carried out his plan.
Corey refused to let Stacy see the end of her pregnancy.
The evidence in the case was overwhelming in terms of the diabolical nature of what Corey did. From the concealing of the cell phones and leaving those behind, to the spray painting outside of the home with an attempt to mislead police.
When you put all of those pieces together, it's a smoking gun.
In response, Corey's defense points the finger back at Alicia Wyatt.
In a jury trial, the defense team is hoping to create any type of reasonable doubt.
His lawyer proceeded with a theory that Alicia was motivated to kill Stacy Jones because she was also impregnated by Corey Deering.
But the jury doesn't buy it.
Fortunately for Stacy's family, the prosecution has met its burden and the state has proven his case. And he is convicted of not 1, but 2 murders.
Once Corey was found guilty of both of those murder counts, the court had no choice but to sentence him to natural life in prison. That is a mandatory sentence in the state of Illinois when there is more than 1 person killed in an incident.
Even though Corey will spend the rest of his life behind bars, Stacy's family feels a lingering frustration that Alicia will never face any legal consequences for her actions.
She drove him. She could have called the police. When she heard the shots, she could have called the police then. So honestly, I think she should be in jail too for accessory before and after the fact.
But no amount of punishment can replace the loss of a young mother who was doing her best to raise 2 good sons, with another one on the way.
There really isn't a win. Stacy's family will never be the same. I know nothing can ever bring her back. For the kids who are involved, to bring their mother back, no sense of justice, but I would hope that they would find their path of healing for themselves.
James Urban Ruppert was 41 years old when the events of Easter Sunday, March 30th, 1975, permanently altered the history of Hamilton, Ohio. By that point, however, the tragedy had been years in the making. To understand what happened inside the modest house at 635 Minor Avenue, it is necessary to begin long before the first gunshot was fired. The story is not one of a sudden explosion of violence born from a single argument. Instead, investigators, mental health experts, and prosecutors would later examine a complicated mixture of long-standing family conflict, social isolation, resentment, financial insecurity, and psychological instability. None of these factors excused what happened, but together they formed the backdrop against which one of America's deadliest familicides unfolded. Hamilton was a quiet industrial city situated north of Cincinnati. In the mid-1970s, it was a community where many residents knew one another. Children played freely in neighborhood streets, and religious holidays remained important family occasions. Easter Sunday was traditionally a day for church services, family meals, and gatherings that brought relatives together after the long winter months. For the Ruppert family, those traditions were no different. The family's matriarch, Charity Ruppert, owned the house on Minor Avenue and looked forward to spending the holiday with her children and grandchildren. She had raised two sons, Leonard Ruppert Jr. and James Urban Ruppert. Although they shared the same family name, the two brothers had followed very different paths in life. Leonard had established a family of his own with his wife, Alma. Together, they were raising 8 children whose ages ranged from 4 to 17. Their home life was busy and often noisy, reflecting the ordinary challenges of a large family. James, by contrast, never married and continued living with his mother in the family home. Those who knew him described him as quiet, withdrawn, and difficult to know. Neighbors rarely saw him engaging in conversation, and acquaintances remembered a man who kept largely to himself. Behind that reserved personality, however, investigators would later discover years of growing dissatisfaction and bitterness. James struggled with alcoholism and had experienced extended periods of unemployment. According to testimony presented during later court proceedings, he believed that his mother treated him unfairly and favored his older brother. Whether those perceptions reflected reality or were influenced by his mental condition became one of the central questions examined during his trial. Mental health professionals who evaluated James after the murders identified evidence of paranoid thinking and deeply rooted resentment that had developed over many years. He reportedly believed that family members criticized him, underestimated him, and prevented him from achieving the life he wanted. While such beliefs may have been genuine to him, they did not necessarily reflect objective reality. Family disagreements are common, but investigators found no evidence that Leonard, Alma, or the children posed any threat to James. Instead, the available evidence suggested that the tensions existed primarily within James's own perception of his relationships. Another important aspect of James's life was his familiarity with firearms. He owned multiple weapons and had considerable experience using them. Friends and acquaintances knew he enjoyed target shooting, making his possession of firearms appear unremarkable in a region where recreational shooting and hunting were common activities. In retrospect, however, prosecutors argued that his knowledge of weapons and marksmanship would later contribute to the efficiency with which the murders were carried out. The day before the killings, March 29, 1975, marked James's 41st birthday. Witnesses later reported seeing him practicing with firearms near the Great Miami River, shooting at cans. At first glance, such activity might not have attracted attention. During the subsequent investigation and trial, however, prosecutors argued that this target practice demonstrated preparation rather than recreation. While the defense challenged various aspects of the prosecution's interpretation, the timing of the practice session inevitably became a significant piece of circumstantial evidence. Easter Sunday arrived with the ordinary routines expected of the holiday. Families throughout Hamilton prepared meals, attended church services, and welcomed relatives into their homes. At 635 Minor Avenue, Charity Ruppert planned the traditional Easter gathering. Leonard, Alma, and their 8 children arrived to celebrate together. The children anticipated one of the day's favorite traditions, searching for Easter eggs hidden around the property. Adults focused on preparing food and enjoying conversation. Nothing about the gathering suggested that it would soon become the scene of unimaginable violence. James remained upstairs for much of the day. Reports indicated that he had spent the previous evening drinking and slept late into the afternoon. At approximately 4 o'clock, he came downstairs and briefly interacted with family members. Available accounts do not describe any significant confrontation or heated argument during this period. After only a short time, he returned upstairs. To everyone else in the house, it likely appeared to be another ordinary moment in a familiar family gathering. No one present could have known that those few minutes represented the last peaceful moments many of them would ever experience. While the family continued celebrating below, James armed himself. Investigators later determined that he assembled 4 firearms, a .357 Magnum revolver, 2.22 caliber handguns, and a .22 caliber rifle. Each weapon had been loaded in advance. During the criminal proceedings that followed, prosecutors argued that bringing multiple loaded firearms downstairs demonstrated planning. Carrying several weapons reduced the possibility of running out of ammunition or experiencing mechanical problems during the attack. The defense, while concentrating primarily on James's mental state, could not dispute the physical evidence concerning the weapons themselves. Their presence would become one of the strongest indicators that the killings were not spontaneous. As investigators later reconstructed the sequence of events, James descended from the upper floor carrying the firearms. Downstairs, family members remained occupied with the holiday gathering. Leonard Jr., Alma, and Charity were in the kitchen area. The children were elsewhere inside the home after their Easter activities. No witness survived to describe the first moments of the attack, leaving investigators to rely upon forensic evidence, bloodstain analysis, ballistic examinations, and the final positions of the victims to reconstruct what happened. According to the prosecution's reconstruction, the first shot struck Leonard Jr. without warning. Alma was shot moments later. Charity attempted to intervene, but was also fatally wounded. Within seconds, the atmosphere of an ordinary Easter celebration had been replaced by terror. The attack then extended to the children, who had no realistic opportunity to defend themselves or escape. Later forensic examinations showed that many victims sustained gunshot wounds to the head, and some were struck by additional shots after already suffering fatal injuries. Investigators concluded that the entire sequence unfolded with extraordinary speed. Evidence suggested the killings lasted less than 5 minutes, during which approximately 44 shots were fired, 40 of them striking victims. Such efficiency reflected not only James's familiarity with firearms, but also the devastating vulnerability of victims caught completely by surprise inside their own family home. The violence that unfolded on Minor Avenue would soon become one of the most shocking family massacres in American history, leaving 11 innocent victims dead and forever changing the lives of everyone connected to the case. In the aftermath, investigators, prosecutors, mental health experts, and the wider public would all struggle with the same haunting question: how could an Easter family gathering end in such overwhelming tragedy? That question would dominate every stage of the investigation, every courtroom proceeding, and every discussion surrounding the case for decades to come. The attack unfolded with a speed that would leave investigators struggling to comprehend how so much devastation could occur in such a brief span of time. Later forensic reconstruction indicated that the shooting lasted less than 5 minutes. Yet those minutes erased nearly an entire family. There were no prolonged confrontations, no drawn-out struggle, and no opportunity for meaningful resistance. Instead, the evidence suggested a carefully executed sequence of violence carried out against people who had gathered for one of Christianity's most important holidays. The first victims were believed to have been Leonard Ruppert Jr., his wife Alma, and the family matriarch Charity Ruppert, who were in or near the kitchen preparing the Easter meal. Because every adult present in the house became a victim, investigators could never establish the exact words spoken immediately before the shooting began. No surviving eyewitness existed to describe whether James Urban Ruppert said anything, issued a warning, or simply opened fire without a word. What remained instead were the physical clues preserved within the house itself. Ballistic analysis, the location of cartridge cases, bullet trajectories, and the positions of the bodies enabled investigators to reconstruct the sequence with reasonable confidence. Leonard Jr. was struck first. Almost immediately afterward, Alma was shot. Charity, who had spent decades raising her family and preparing countless holiday meals in the same home, was also fatally wounded. The forensic evidence suggested that these attacks occurred within only a matter of seconds. Once the three adults had fallen, the remaining victims were left almost entirely defenseless. The 8 children ranged in age from 4 to 17 years old. Their Easter celebration had begun like countless others, with family traditions and the excitement that accompanies a holiday gathering. Instead, those ordinary moments ended in unimaginable violence. Investigators later concluded that James systematically moved through the house, firing at each child in turn. The medical examinations revealed that many victims sustained gunshot wounds to the head at close range. In several cases, additional shots were fired after the initial wound, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that the attack demonstrated deliberate intent rather than panic or confusion. Although the forensic evidence revealed the mechanics of the killings, it could never fully explain the human experience inside the house during those final moments. Investigators were careful not to speculate beyond what the evidence supported. They acknowledged that some victims may have realized what was happening only moments before they were attacked, while others may have had little or no understanding of the danger until it was too late. One detail, repeatedly emphasized during later discussions of the case, was the near absence of evidence indicating prolonged resistance. Aside from a single overturned wastebasket noted during the investigation, there were few signs of a sustained struggle. This finding supported the conclusion that the victims were caught entirely by surprise and overwhelmed almost immediately. As crime scene specialists continued documenting the house, they found that the violence had been concentrated primarily on the first floor. Bloodstain patterns, bullet damage, and the positions of the victims allowed investigators to chart James's movement through the residence. Every room became part of a tragic timeline that unfolded in only a few minutes. The attack ended as suddenly as it had begun. Yet one of the most unsettling aspects of the case occurred afterward. Rather than fleeing the scene or attempting to conceal his actions, James remained inside the house for several hours. Investigators estimated that he stayed among the bodies of his family members for approximately 3 to 4 hours before contacting authorities. During that period, no neighbors reported hearing additional gunfire or unusual disturbances. The quiet that settled over the neighborhood contrasted sharply with the horror concealed inside the residence. As evening approached, James finally telephoned the police. According to official accounts, his message was remarkably brief. He simply reported that there had been a shooting. The call lacked the panic or confusion commonly associated with emergency reports. Officers responding to the address could not have anticipated the magnitude of what awaited them. Upon arrival at 635 Minor Avenue, they encountered James outside the residence. He offered no armed resistance and surrendered without incident. Officers immediately secured him and entered the house to determine whether additional victims or suspects were present. What they discovered became one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Butler County history. 11 members of the same family lay dead inside the home. Experienced investigators who had worked numerous homicide cases later described the scene as unlike anything they had previously encountered. The extent of the bloodshed reflected the extraordinary number of victims killed within such a confined space. Prosecutors later recalled that blood had flowed across portions of the wooden flooring and seeped through gaps into the basement below, illustrating the sheer scale of the violence rather than serving as sensational detail. Crime scene technicians spent countless hours documenting every room. Thousands of photographs were taken before any evidence was disturbed. Firearms were carefully recovered, rendered safe, and cataloged. Every bullet fragment, cartridge casing, and bloodstain became part of an extensive forensic record. The investigation quickly established that no signs of forced entry existed anywhere in the residence. Doors and windows remained intact. Valuable property was undisturbed, and there was no evidence suggesting the involvement of an outside intruder. The physical evidence consistently pointed toward a single offender acting alone. Ballistics testing matched the recovered projectiles to the firearms found in James's possession. Fingerprint examinations likewise failed to reveal evidence of another perpetrator. As investigators interviewed neighbors and relatives, they learned that the Easter gathering had appeared entirely ordinary before the attack. No witness described hearing arguments immediately beforehand, although some acquaintances recalled long-standing family tensions and James's withdrawn personality. No one reported seeing behavior that afternoon, which clearly foreshadowed the massacre. This absence of an obvious triggering event became one of the central mysteries surrounding the case. Detectives then turned their attention toward understanding James himself. His employment history, financial circumstances, medical background, and relationships with family members all became subjects of intensive review. Interviews suggested a man who had become increasingly isolated over the years. Witnesses described alcoholism, persistent resentment, and long-standing beliefs that he had been treated unfairly within the family. Mental health experts would later examine these claims in considerable detail, seeking to determine whether they reflected genuine psychiatric illness, deeply rooted personal grievances, or a combination of both. Yet investigators remained focused on evidence rather than speculation. The physical facts established beyond dispute that James had possessed multiple loaded firearms, had remained in the house after the killings, had personally contacted law enforcement, and had surrendered peacefully upon their arrival. These uncontested facts formed the foundation upon which prosecutors would later build their case. As news of the massacre spread through Hamilton and across the nation, public reaction was immediate. The idea that 11 members of one family, including 8 children, could be killed during an Easter celebration shocked even experienced law enforcement officials. Community members struggled to reconcile the peaceful image of a family holiday with the reality. Uncovered inside the Minor Avenue home, churches held memorial services for the victims, local residents expressed profound grief, and investigators worked under intense public scrutiny to answer the question that everyone seemed to ask: why had this happened? Although the investigation had established who carried out the shootings, determining the motive would prove far more difficult. That challenge would dominate the legal proceedings to come, where prosecutors argued that the evidence demonstrated planning and deliberate intent, while the defense prepared to present a very different explanation centered on James Urban Ruppert's mental state. The courtroom would soon become the setting for one of Ohio's most closely watched criminal cases, where the physical evidence was largely undisputed, but the meaning behind it remained fiercely contested. In the hours following the massacre, the residence on Minor Avenue transformed from a family home into one of the most extensively documented crime scenes in Butler County history. The immediate priority for investigators was to secure every piece of physical evidence before memories faded or contamination became possible. Uniformed officers established a perimeter around the property, while detectives, crime scene photographers, forensic specialists, and representatives from the county prosecutor's office began the painstaking process of documenting what had occurred. Every room was photographed from multiple angles before a single item was moved. Investigators carefully marked the locations of firearms, cartridge cases, bullet impacts, and each victim. Measurements were taken throughout the residence so that a detailed reconstruction could later be presented in court. The work continued late into the night, interrupted only by the difficult task of respectfully removing the victims after forensic documentation had been completed. Because the suspect had surrendered without resistance and remained in police custody, investigators were able to focus entirely on reconstructing the sequence of events rather than searching for additional offenders. Early in the investigation, detectives established that there were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. Doors and windows remained intact, locks showed no evidence of tampering, and valuable personal belongings had not been disturbed. This eliminated robbery or burglary as possible motives almost immediately. Instead, every physical indicator pointed toward violence committed by someone who belonged inside the home and who had unrestricted access to every room. The firearms recovered at the scene became central pieces of evidence. Investigators documented a .357 Magnum revolver, 2.22 caliber handguns, and a .22 caliber rifle. Each weapon was processed for fingerprints, examined for mechanical function, and subjected to ballistic testing. Laboratory analysis confirmed that the bullets recovered from the victims and throughout the residence had been fired from those weapons. Equally significant was the fact that investigators found no evidence suggesting another shooter had been present. The recovered firearms, cartridge cases, and ballistic trajectories were all consistent with a single individual moving methodically through the house. This conclusion would remain unchanged throughout the investigation and later became one of the strongest pillars supporting the prosecution's case. Autopsies conducted on the 11 victims provided additional insight into the attack. Medical examiners determined that many victims had sustained gunshot wounds to the head, while others suffered multiple wounds. In several cases, the injuries indicated that additional shots had been fired after an initial incapacitating wound. Although the forensic reports established the cause of death with certainty, investigators deliberately avoided speculation regarding the precise emotional experiences of the victims during their final moments. Instead, they relied on objective medical findings to demonstrate the sequence and nature of the attack. The relatively limited evidence of prolonged struggle remained one of the case's most striking characteristics. Aside from an overturned wastebasket and minor signs of movement consistent with individuals reacting to sudden violence, the house contained little indication of sustained resistance. Investigators interpreted this to mean that the shootings unfolded so quickly that most victims had virtually no opportunity to escape or defend themselves. The speed of the attack also explained why neighbors reported hearing gunfire, but were unable to intervene before the killings had ended. While forensic teams processed the physical evidence, detectives began interviewing relatives, neighbors, former co-workers, and acquaintances in an effort to understand James Urban Ruppert's background. The interviews painted a picture of a man who had become increasingly isolated over the years. Several individuals described him as intelligent but withdrawn, someone who rarely participated in social activities and often appeared uncomfortable around others. His struggles with alcohol were widely known among those familiar with him, and multiple witnesses described periods of unemployment that had contributed to financial difficulties and growing frustration. More importantly, investigators repeatedly heard descriptions of long-standing tension within the family. According to various witnesses, James frequently believed that his mother favored his brother Leonard. Whether those perceptions reflected actual family dynamics or were amplified by James's psychological condition remained uncertain. But the belief itself appeared deeply rooted. Detectives also learned that James had expressed resentment over financial matters and his dependence on living in the family home. These interviews did not establish a single definitive motive, but they revealed patterns of grievance that investigators believed were relevant to understanding the tragedy. One particularly important line of inquiry involved James's activities on March 29th, the day before the killings. Witnesses confirmed seeing him target shooting near the Great Miami River. Although recreational shooting was not uncommon, Prosecutors later argued that the timing suggested preparation rather than leisure. Detectives carefully documented these witness statements because they believed they demonstrated that James had handled and practiced with firearms immediately before carrying out the attack. During subsequent legal proceedings, the defense would challenge the significance of this evidence, arguing that target shooting alone did not prove premeditation. Nevertheless, investigators considered the witness accounts an important component of the overall timeline. James himself provided little assistance during the investigation. Following his arrest, he exercised his legal rights and did not offer investigators a detailed explanation for his actions. As a result, detectives were forced to rely almost entirely on physical evidence. Witness interviews, forensic examinations, and expert analysis. The absence of a confession meant that many questions surrounding motive could never be answered directly by the only surviving participant. Instead, every conclusion would need to be supported by objective evidence presented during trial. Recognizing that James's mental condition would almost certainly become a major issue, authorities arranged for comprehensive psychiatric evaluations. Mental health experts interviewed him extensively, reviewed his personal history, and assessed his ability to understand the criminal proceedings against him. These evaluations would later become one of the most contested aspects of the case. Some experts identified evidence of paranoid thinking and long-term psychological disturbance, while prosecutors emphasized that the careful preparation of the weapons, the systematic manner of the shootings, and James's actions after the massacre suggested purposeful behavior rather than uncontrollable impulse. The investigation therefore developed along two parallel tracks. One focused on establishing exactly how the murders occurred through forensic science and physical evidence. The other sought to understand why they occurred by examining James's mental state, relationships, and personal history. The first task produced clear and largely uncontested answers. The second proved far more complex. As public attention intensified, newspapers across Ohio and throughout the United States closely followed every development. The extraordinary scale of the crime, 11 members of one family killed during an Easter gathering, captured national attention. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, interviewed neighbors, and published detailed accounts of the investigation. Yet despite widespread media coverage, investigators remained careful to distinguish between confirmed evidence and speculation. They understood that a case of such magnitude would inevitably generate rumors, and preserving the integrity of the evidence became essential for the prosecution that lay ahead. After weeks of collecting statements, completing forensic examinations, and consulting expert witnesses, authorities concluded that the evidence overwhelmingly supported a single narrative. James Urban Ruppert had armed himself with multiple loaded firearms, descended into the family gathering, systematically killed 11 relatives, remained inside the residence for several hours, contacted police, and surrendered peacefully upon their arrival. The physical evidence left little doubt regarding who had committed the killings. The legal battle that followed would therefore center not on identity, but on criminal responsibility. Prosecutors prepared to argue that the murders were deliberate and carefully planned, while defense attorneys assembled a case centered on severe mental illness. The courtroom would soon become the place where those competing interpretations would be tested before a jury. As one of the most significant familicide cases in American history entered its next and most closely watched chapter. As the investigation concluded, attention shifted from the crime scene to the courtroom, where the legal system faced the difficult task of determining not whether James Urban Ruppert had committed the killings, but whether he should be held criminally responsible for them. Unlike many homicide cases in which the identity of the perpetrator remains uncertain for months or even years, the Easter Sunday massacre presented investigators with an unusual situation. The suspect had remained at the scene, contacted law enforcement himself, and surrendered without resistance. The physical evidence overwhelmingly established that he had carried out the shootings. Consequently, The central issue at trial would become his mental condition at the time of the offense. Prosecutors and defense attorneys prepared for what would become a lengthy legal battle involving extensive psychiatric testimony, forensic evidence, and competing interpretations of James's state of mind. Before trial could begin, the court addressed the question of competency. Mental health professionals conducted comprehensive evaluations to determine whether James understood the legal proceedings and was capable of assisting in his own defense. Competency to stand trial is distinct from the question of criminal responsibility at the time of the offense. A defendant may suffer from mental illness, yet still possess sufficient understanding of courtroom proceedings to participate in a defense. Following psychiatric examinations, James was ultimately found competent to stand trial, allowing the criminal case to proceed. The prosecution strategy focused on demonstrating that the massacre had been carefully planned and deliberately executed. Prosecutors argued that James's actions before, during, and after the killings reflected organization rather than confusion. One of the most significant pieces of evidence involved the firearms themselves. Rather than relying on a single weapon, James had assembled 4 loaded firearms before descending the stairs. Prosecutors argued that carrying multiple weapons reduced the possibility of running out of ammunition or experiencing mechanical failure, indicating forethought rather than spontaneous violence. They also emphasized testimony regarding James's target practice on the day before the murders. Although recreational shooting was not unusual, the prosecution contended that the timing suggested preparation for the attack. Another important aspect of the prosecution's case involved the systematic nature of the shootings. Ballistic evidence demonstrated that James moved through the residence in an organized manner, firing accurately at individual victims. Medical testimony established that several victims suffered multiple gunshot wounds, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that the killings reflected deliberate intent. Prosecutors further highlighted James's behavior after the massacre. Rather than fleeing, destroying evidence, or attempting suicide, he remained in the house for several hours before telephoning police and calmly reporting that there had been a shooting. According to the prosecution, these actions suggested that James understood what he had done and recognized the consequences of his conduct. The defense did not dispute that James had killed his family members. Instead, defense attorneys concentrated almost entirely on his mental state. Their argument rested upon psychiatric evaluations indicating that James had experienced significant psychological disturbances for many years. Mental health experts called by the defense described symptoms consistent with paranoid thinking, distorted perceptions of family relationships, and deeply entrenched delusional beliefs. According to these experts, James genuinely believed that his mother favored his brother Leonard, and that he had spent years being mistreated, criticized, and marginalized within his own family. The defense argued that these beliefs had become so overwhelming that they fundamentally impaired his ability to appreciate the nature or wrongfulness of his actions. Psychiatric testimony became the defining feature of the trial. Expert witnesses presented differing conclusions regarding James's condition, often interpreting the same facts in dramatically different ways. Defense experts described an individual whose thinking had become increasingly detached from reality. Over many years, they emphasized his alcoholism, prolonged social isolation, unemployment, and persistent feelings of persecution within his family. In their view, the massacre resulted from severe mental illness rather than calculated criminal intent. Prosecutors responded by carefully examining each expert's conclusions during cross-examination. They argued that mental illness alone does not eliminate criminal responsibility. Instead, they focused on evidence demonstrating purposeful behavior before and after the shootings. The careful preparation of multiple loaded firearms, the methodical movement through the residence, and James's decision to notify law enforcement after the killings were all presented as evidence that he understood the nature of his actions. Prosecutors maintained that whatever psychological problems James may have experienced, they did not prevent him from forming intent or appreciating the consequences of his conduct. The courtroom heard extensive testimony from investigators who had processed the crime scene. They described the positions of the victims, the location of recovered firearms, ballistic evidence, and the absence of signs indicating the presence of any additional offender. Crime scene photographs, diagrams, and forensic reports were introduced to help jurors understand the sequence reconstructed by investigators. Medical examiners explained the victim's injuries in clinical, objective language, avoiding speculation while establishing the fatal nature of the wounds. Their testimony reinforced the prosecution's argument that the attack had been carried out systematically and with extraordinary speed. Witnesses who knew James before the massacre also testified. Some described him as quiet and socially withdrawn, while others recalled increasing bitterness regarding his family circumstances. Several witnesses acknowledged that James appeared resentful toward his mother and believed his brother received preferential treatment. Yet few testified to witnessing specific conflicts immediately preceding the murders. This absence of a recent triggering event underscored one of the case's enduring mysteries. The violence appeared to emerge not from a single confrontation, but from grievances that had accumulated over many years. Throughout the proceedings, the jury faced an exceptionally difficult responsibility. The physical facts of the case were largely undisputed, but determining James's legal responsibility required evaluating complex psychiatric evidence alongside objective forensic findings. Jurors were instructed to distinguish between the existence of mental illness and the legal standards governing criminal responsibility. This distinction became the central issue they would ultimately decide. Following the presentation of evidence and closing arguments, the jury deliberated before reaching its verdict. James Urban Ruppert was found guilty of the murders. Although the defense had presented extensive psychiatric testimony, the jury concluded that the evidence demonstrated criminal responsibility under Ohio law. The verdict reflected acceptance of the prosecution's argument that James had planned and intentionally carried out the killings despite any psychological problems he may have experienced. The conviction represented only one stage in a legal process that would continue for years. Appeals followed, raising issues concerning psychiatric testimony, trial procedures, and legal standards governing criminal responsibility. Appellate courts reviewed multiple aspects of the proceedings, resulting in further legal developments before the case ultimately reached its final resolution. Even as those appeals progressed, however, one fact remained unchanged. 11 members of a single family had lost their lives during what should have been a peaceful Easter celebration. The courtroom proceedings sought to determine legal accountability, but they could never restore what had been taken from the victims or erase the profound grief experienced by surviving relatives and the wider Hamilton community. The legal debates surrounding mental illness, intent, and criminal responsibility would continue to attract attention from legal scholars and mental health professionals for decades, ensuring that the Easter Sunday massacre remained not only one of the deadliest familicides in American history, but also one of its most extensively examined criminal cases. Although the jury had reached a verdict, the Easter Sunday massacre did not simply disappear from public attention. Instead, the legal proceedings entered another chapter through the appeals process, where defense attorneys continued to argue that James Urban Ruppert's psychological condition had not been fully or fairly considered. Appeals in major criminal cases rarely revisit every factual detail of the crime itself. Instead, appellate courts examine whether the defendant received a fair trial, whether legal standards were properly applied, and whether procedural errors may have influenced the outcome. In Ruppert's case, the central questions once again revolved around psychiatric testimony and criminal responsibility. Defense attorneys maintained that the evidence presented during trial demonstrated a level of mental illness significant enough to raise serious doubts regarding his legal culpability. Prosecutors, however, continued to argue that the planning demonstrated before the murders, the systematic nature of the shootings, and his behavior afterward all supported the jury's conclusion that he remained criminally responsible for his actions. The appellate process extended the public discussion surrounding the case well beyond the initial trial. Newspapers revisited the evidence. Legal commentators debated the role of psychiatric experts in homicide prosecutions, and many observers questioned where the legal system should draw the line between severe mental illness and criminal accountability. These discussions reflected a broader issue that extended far beyond one courtroom. Throughout the United States during the 1970s, courts increasingly faced difficult cases involving psychiatric defenses, forcing judges and juries to weigh medical expertise against legal definitions of responsibility. The Easter Sunday Massacre became one example frequently referenced in those conversations because the identity of the killer had never been disputed. Instead, every legal argument focused upon understanding the state of mind behind one of the deadliest acts of family violence in American history. While attorneys argued legal standards inside appellate courtrooms, the city of Hamilton continued living with the emotional consequences of the massacre. For many residents, the address on Minor Avenue no longer represented an ordinary neighborhood home. It had become permanently associated with unimaginable loss. Neighbors who had once watched the Ruppert children play outside now struggled to reconcile those memories with the knowledge that the entire family had been destroyed within minutes. The murders left an emotional scar that extended well beyond relatives. Police officers who entered the house that evening later acknowledged that the scene remained unforgettable throughout their careers. Investigators who had processed numerous homicide cases described the massacre as one of the most emotionally challenging investigations they had ever undertaken. Not because the forensic questions were unusually complex, but because of the extraordinary number of victims and the fact that 8 of them were children. Crime scene investigators are trained to remain objective, documenting evidence rather than emotion. Yet even experienced professionals recognized that some cases inevitably leave a lasting psychological impact. Medical examiners likewise approached the victims with clinical professionalism, carefully documenting every injury to ensure that the legal record accurately reflected the physical evidence. Their reports became an essential part of the prosecution's case. But behind every page of forensic documentation stood the reality that each victim had been a member of the same family gathered to celebrate a holiday together only hours earlier. For surviving relatives outside the immediate household, the aftermath brought an entirely different challenge. Entire branches of the family tree had vanished in a single afternoon. Funeral arrangements became almost unimaginable in their scale. Rather than mourning one loved one, relatives faced the heartbreaking responsibility of honoring 11 victims at once. The emotional burden of such a loss is difficult to measure, and many family members understandably chose to grieve away from public attention. Unlike modern criminal cases, where extensive media interviews with surviving relatives often become part of the public record, much of the family's private mourning remained exactly that, private. Their silence should not be interpreted as an absence of grief, but rather as a reflection of the deeply personal nature of catastrophic loss. Beyond Hamilton itself, the massacre contributed to growing public awareness of familicide, a form of homicide in which one family member kills multiple relatives. Although such crimes had occurred before 1975, they remained comparatively rare. And each major incident prompted renewed efforts by criminologists and mental health professionals to identify common warning signs. Researchers examining familicide frequently noted recurring themes such as prolonged social isolation, unresolved personal grievances, perceived humiliation, financial stress, deteriorating family relationships, and untreated mental health problems. Importantly, experts consistently emphasized that none of these factors alone predict violent behavior. Millions of individuals experience financial hardship, depression, addiction, or family conflict without ever committing acts of violence. Consequently, investigators cautioned against simplistic explanations that attribute such tragedies to a single cause. The Easter Sunday Massacre demonstrated how complex these cases often are, involving numerous interacting personal, psychological, and social factors that cannot easily be reduced to one motive. Mental health professionals also examined the case through the lens of paranoid thinking. Testimony presented during trial suggested that James believed he had been treated unfairly by members of his family, particularly by his mother and brother. Whether those beliefs reflected reality or were significantly distorted by mental illness became one of the central disputes during the legal proceedings. Subsequent discussions among psychiatrists frequently cited the case as an example of the difficulty involved in distinguishing between long-standing resentment and clinically significant delusional thinking. Legal responsibility requires more than the presence of mental illness, and the case illustrated how challenging that distinction can become when psychiatric evidence is presented before a jury. Law enforcement agencies likewise found practical lessons within the investigation. Detectives pointed to the importance of preserving crime scenes, conducting meticulous ballistic examinations, documenting victim locations with precision, and avoiding premature conclusions unsupported by evidence. Because James had surrendered immediately and the physical evidence overwhelmingly established his role, investigators were able to concentrate on reconstructing the sequence of events with exceptional detail. Their work demonstrated how forensic science could establish not only who committed a crime, but also how it unfolded minute by minute. Years later, the Easter Sunday Massacre continued to be studied in criminal justice courses, forensic training programs, and discussions of major American homicide investigations. It remained significant not because it involved an unsolved mystery, but because nearly every aspect of the offender's identity was known, while the deeper question of motive resisted any simple answer. Historians, criminologists, psychologists, and legal scholars continued examining the same evidence from different perspectives, each attempting to understand how years of personal grievances, psychological instability, and access to firearms culminated in such overwhelming violence. Yet despite decades of analysis, no academic study or legal opinion could lessen the suffering endured by the victims or the community they left behind. Their lives ended during what should have been an ordinary family celebration, transforming Easter Sunday of 1975 into a date forever remembered for tragedy rather than hope. In the end, the enduring legacy of the Easter Sunday Massacre lies not in the notoriety of the offender, but in the reminder of how profoundly a single act of violence can alter countless lives. The legal proceedings eventually concluded, the appeals reached their end, and the case entered the historical record, but the names of the victims continued to represent far more than evidence presented in court. They were members of a family whose holiday gathering became one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. Their story continues to be remembered not to glorify the man responsible, but to acknowledge the lives that were lost, the lessons learned by investigators and mental health professionals, and the importance of understanding family violence with accuracy, compassion, and respect for those whose voices were permanently silenced. Decades after the events of March 30th, 1975, the Easter Sunday Massacre remained one of the most disturbing examples of family violence in American criminal history. Unlike many notorious crimes that remain surrounded by unanswered questions about the identity of the offender, the case of James Urban Ruppert was different. Investigators knew who was responsible almost immediately. The evidence recovered from the house, the firearms connected to the shootings, the absence of any signs of an outside intruder, and Ruppert's own surrender to authorities created a clear picture of what had happened inside the Minor Avenue residence. Yet even with those questions answered, the case continued to be examined because the deeper issues surrounding it were far more complicated. The tragedy raised difficult questions about family relationships, mental health, criminal responsibility, and whether warning signs can be recognized before violence occurs. The victims remained at the center of those discussions. While public attention often focused on James Ruppert because he was the person responsible for the massacre, the human impact of the case belonged to the 11 people whose lives ended that Easter Sunday. Leonard Ruppert Jr., Alma Ruppert, Charity Ruppert, and the 8 children were not simply names in a criminal investigation. They were members of a family who had gathered for a holiday tradition, expecting an ordinary day together. The children had arrived for a family celebration, and the adults had prepared for a meal and time together. The sudden loss of so many relatives in a single event created a tragedy that extended beyond the walls of the house and affected everyone connected to them. One of the lasting lessons from the case involved the challenge of understanding familicide. Researchers studying family annihilation cases have often examined common patterns among offenders, including social isolation, personal grievances, financial stress, substance abuse, and psychological difficulties. However, experts have repeatedly emphasized that these factors are not simple predictors of violence. Many people experience hardship, depression, addiction, or family conflict without ever becoming violent. The Easter Sunday Massacre demonstrated the danger of searching for a single explanation for a complex crime. The circumstances surrounding James Ruppert involved multiple elements that had developed over time, but none alone could fully explain the decision to murder his entire family. The case also became part of broader conversations about mental health and the criminal justice system. During the trial, the defense presented psychiatric evidence regarding Ruppert's psychological condition, while prosecutors argued that his preparation and actions demonstrated awareness and intent. The disagreement reflected a continuing challenge within courts across the United States, determining how mental illness should be considered when evaluating criminal responsibility. The existence of a mental disorder does not automatically determine whether someone is legally responsible for their actions. Courts must examine specific legal standards, including whether the individual understood the nature of their conduct and whether they could recognize its wrongfulness. The Ruppert case became an example of how difficult those evaluations can become when severe violence and psychiatric testimony intersect. The investigation itself also demonstrated the importance of forensic procedures in major criminal cases, because there were no surviving witnesses to describe the attack. Investigators relied heavily on physical evidence. Ballistics examinations connected the recovered firearms to the bullets found at the scene. Crime scene documentation allowed investigators to reconstruct the movement of the offender through the residence. Medical examinations established the causes and patterns of the victim's injuries. Each piece of evidence contributed to a larger reconstruction of events. The investigation showed how modern forensic methods could transform a chaotic and devastating crime scene into an organized timeline that could be presented in court. Another significant aspect of the case was the role of law enforcement after the shootings. Officers arriving at the residence faced an extraordinary situation. A suspect had already identified himself, yet the full extent of the tragedy inside the home was not immediately known. Once the scene was secured, investigators had to balance the demands of a major homicide investigation with the need to treat the victims and their families with dignity. The emotional burden carried by first responders and investigators became another reminder that the effects of violent crime extend beyond those directly involved. The people who document, investigate, and respond to such events often carry the memory of what they witnessed for the remainder of their careers. Over the years, the Easter Sunday Massacre continued to appear in discussions of American criminal history because of the scale of the tragedy and the circumstances surrounding it. It was not an unsolved mystery, nor was it a case where investigators lacked evidence. Instead, it became significant because it represented a devastating example of violence occurring within a family environment that should have been a place of safety. The case challenged assumptions about familiarity and trust, demonstrating that the greatest dangers sometimes emerge not from strangers, but from individuals within close personal relationships. Despite the attention given to the offender and the legal proceedings, the most important historical perspective remains the recognition of the victims. True crime discussions can sometimes focus heavily on perpetrators, examining their backgrounds, motivations, and psychology. While understanding offenders can be important for prevention and research, excessive attention can unintentionally overshadow those who suffered. In the case of the Easter Sunday massacre, remembering the victims requires acknowledging that they were individuals with relationships, experiences, and futures that were permanently taken away. Their identities should not be reduced only to their connection to a tragedy. The passage of time did not erase the significance of what happened at 635 Minor Avenue. The case remained a subject of study because it represented a convergence of many difficult issues: family conflict, mental health concerns, access to firearms, investigative procedures, and the limits of predicting human behavior. Each generation examining the case approached it with new questions, but the central reality remained unchanged. 11 people lost their lives during what should have been a celebration of family and renewal. The ultimate lesson of the Easter Sunday massacre is not found in the actions of the person who committed the crime, but in the importance of recognizing the humanity of those who were lost and understanding the circumstances that surround extreme acts of violence. The case continues to serve as a reminder that behind every criminal investigation are real people, whose lives mattered long before they became part of a historical record. The responsibility of remembering such tragedies is not only to examine how they happened, but also to honor the victims and learn from the questions they leave behind. In the years following the Easter Sunday massacre, the case continued to represent one of the most painful examples of how violence can emerge within a family environment that appears ordinary from the outside. The events of March 30th, 1975, were not remembered only because of the number of victims or the identity of the person responsible, but because of the profound contradiction at the center of the tragedy. A day associated with family, faith, and renewal became the setting for an act of destruction that ended 11 lives. That contrast remained one of the reasons the case continued to attract attention from investigators, legal professionals, and researchers studying extreme forms of domestic violence. The passage of time did not change the fundamental facts of the case. James Urban Ruppert entered the family gathering armed with multiple firearms, killed 11 relatives, remained at the residence afterward, contacted authorities, and surrendered. The evidence established the sequence of events, but the questions surrounding how such an act could occur within a family continued to receive attention long after the courtroom proceedings ended. One of the most significant aspects of the case was the difficulty of identifying a single motive. In many criminal investigations, authorities search for a specific trigger, a financial dispute, a personal confrontation, revenge, or another immediate cause. In the Easter Sunday massacre, however, investigators found a much more complicated picture. Evidence and testimony suggested years of resentment, personal frustration, social isolation, and psychological problems. These factors created a background of instability, but they did not provide a simple explanation for the decision to commit mass murder. The absence of a clear, singular motive made the case particularly difficult for the public to understand. Many people wanted to know what final event caused such extreme violence, but the available evidence suggested that the tragedy resulted from a combination of long-developing issues rather than one isolated moment. The case also highlighted the challenge faced by families and communities when someone begins showing signs of emotional deterioration. According to information presented during legal proceedings, James had become increasingly isolated and experienced significant personal difficulties. He struggled with unemployment, alcohol use, and feelings of resentment toward family members. Mental health experts later examined his psychological condition and discussed symptoms involving paranoia and distorted perceptions of his relationships. However, identifying emotional or psychological problems after a tragedy is much easier than predicting future violence before it occurs. This distinction became one of the most important lessons connected to the case. Not every person experiencing depression, anger, isolation, or personal hardship will become violent. The vast majority do not. The challenge for communities and professionals is recognizing situations where multiple warning signs combine in ways that may require intervention. The Easter Sunday Massacre became part of wider discussions about prevention because it demonstrated the devastating consequences that can occur when serious problems remain unresolved. The role of firearms also became a significant topic in discussions surrounding the case. James's familiarity with weapons and the availability of multiple firearms played an important role in how quickly the massacre unfolded. Investigators determined that the weapons used in the attack belonged to him and that there was no evidence of another offender. The case contributed to broader conversations about firearm access, especially in situations involving individuals experiencing severe emotional distress or escalating personal conflicts. These discussions continue in many communities as experts attempt to balance individual rights with efforts to reduce preventable violence. From a criminal justice perspective, the case demonstrated the importance of separating several different questions that are often confused by the public. The first question was whether James committed the killings. The evidence clearly established that he did. The second question was why he committed them. That question proved much more difficult and involved psychological, personal, and social factors. The third question was whether he should be held legally responsible. That issue required the court to evaluate psychiatric evidence and apply legal standards regarding criminal responsibility. The distinction between these questions shaped the entire trial and influenced how the case was discussed afterward. For investigators, the massacre also served as an example of the importance of detailed reconstruction. Because no one survived the attack to provide a first-hand account, detectives depended on physical evidence. The location of victims, ballistic findings, firearm examinations, and medical reports allowed authorities to establish a reliable timeline. This process demonstrated how forensic investigation can provide answers even when direct testimony is unavailable. Each piece of evidence became part of a larger picture, allowing investigators and prosecutors to explain what happened inside the residence. Yet forensic evidence, while capable of explaining the mechanics of a crime, cannot fully capture the human consequences. Numbers in police reports and courtroom documents represent real individuals whose lives extended far beyond the circumstances of their deaths. The children who lost their lives were not simply victims in a criminal case. They were members of a family with ordinary experiences, relationships, and futures that were never realized. The adults in the family were not merely names listed in investigative files. They were people who had built connections, cared for relatives, and expected to spend a holiday together. Remembering those personal realities remains essential when discussing any true crime case. Over time, the Easter Sunday Massacre became a subject studied not because it revealed a simple answer to human violence, but because it showed how complicated such tragedies can be. The case forced society to examine uncomfortable questions about mental health, family conflict, warning signs, and the limitations of prevention. It demonstrated that understanding violence requires more than identifying the person responsible. It requires examining the circumstances that surrounded the event while never losing sight of the victims themselves. More than 4 decades after the tragedy, the case continues to stand as a reminder of the importance of compassion, awareness, and careful examination of the factors that contribute to extreme acts of violence. The story of the Easter Sunday Massacre is ultimately not only about what happened inside one house in Hamilton, Ohio. It is about the lives that were lost, the community that was changed forever, and the continuing effort to understand how such a devastating event could happen. History remembers the crime, but the responsibility of remembrance belongs to the victims and the lives they represented before tragedy placed them in the pages of a criminal record. The story of the Easter Sunday Massacre did not end when the courtroom proceedings concluded. While the legal system had determined James Urban Ruppert's responsibility for the deaths of 11 members of his family, the broader questions surrounding the tragedy remained subjects of discussion for decades. Cases of extreme family violence often leave behind a complicated legacy because they force communities to examine not only the actions of the offender, but also the circumstances that existed before the crime occurred. The Hamilton, Ohio, massacre became one of those cases, remembered not simply as a criminal event, but as a devastating example of how personal grievances, psychological struggles, and family tensions can intersect with catastrophic consequences. In the years after the killings, researchers and criminal justice professionals continued to study the case as part of a larger effort to understand familicide. This type of crime differs from many other forms of homicide because the offender and victim share a close relationship. The violence does not occur between strangers or distant acquaintances. Instead, it destroys the very relationships that are normally associated with safety and trust. The Easter Sunday massacre represented an extreme example of this pattern because nearly every person inside the home was connected to the offender through family ties. The scale of the loss made the case especially significant in discussions of domestic violence and family annihilation. One of the most difficult aspects of examining the case was understanding the difference between explanation and justification. Investigators, psychiatrists, and legal professionals attempted to understand James Ruppert's background and mental condition, but understanding why a crime occurred does not excuse the actions of the person who committed it. This distinction remained central throughout the trial and continued to shape later discussions. Mental health professionals examined his psychological state, while prosecutors emphasized that planning and deliberate actions demonstrated responsibility. Both perspectives reflected different attempts to answer separate questions: what factors contributed to the tragedy, and who should be held accountable for it. The case also became part of a broader conversation about missed warning signs. After major acts of violence, communities often look backward and search for moments that might have predicted what would happen. In Ruppert's case, witnesses described a history of isolation, resentment, and personal difficulties. These details became important after the fact because they provided context. However, recognizing warning signs after a tragedy has occurred is very different from predicting violence before it happens. Many individuals experience anger, disappointment, financial hardship, or mental health challenges without ever becoming violent. The challenge faced by families, communities, and professionals is identifying when ordinary struggles may be developing into a situation requiring serious intervention. Another lasting discussion connected to the case involved the role of firearms. James Ruppert's access to multiple weapons and his ability to use them effectively contributed to the speed and severity of the attack. Investigators found that he had prepared several loaded firearms before beginning the shootings. This fact became one of the major points emphasized during the trial because prosecutors viewed it as evidence of planning. Beyond the courtroom, the case became part of larger debates throughout the United States regarding firearm access, particularly in situations involving individuals experiencing serious personal crises. Those discussions continue because communities continue searching for ways to reduce the possibility of similar tragedies while respecting legal and social considerations surrounding gun ownership. The investigation itself also became an example of how law enforcement responds to complex mass homicide scenes. The absence of a surviving eyewitness meant investigators had to rely heavily on physical evidence. Every detail inside the Minor Avenue residence contributed to the reconstruction of events. Ballistics examinations connected weapons to recovered bullets. Medical examinations established how the victims died. Crime scene documentation provided a timeline that allowed prosecutors to explain the sequence of events to a jury. The careful work of investigators demonstrated the importance of patience and accuracy when dealing with crimes involving multiple victims. Beyond the evidence and legal arguments, however, the emotional impact on the Hamilton community remained one of the most significant consequences of the massacre. Residents were forced to confront the reality that a familiar neighborhood had become the location of one of the most shocking crimes in the region's history. The house on Minor Avenue was no longer viewed simply as a family residence. It became permanently associated with loss and tragedy. For neighbors and community members, the event represented a painful reminder that violence can occur in places that appear peaceful and ordinary. The passage of time brought changes to Hamilton, as it did to every community, but the memory of the victims remained connected to the location and the date of the tragedy. The case also illustrated the limitations of the criminal justice system in answering every question. Left behind by a violent crime, courts can determine guilt or innocence, evaluate evidence, and impose sentences. They can establish responsibility according to legal standards. However, they cannot fully explain human behavior or repair the emotional damage caused by the loss of loved ones. For the families and friends affected by the massacre, the legal outcome could never restore what had been taken from them. The conviction represented accountability, but it did not erase grief. In discussions of notorious crimes, there is often a risk that attention becomes centered almost entirely on the offender. Criminal investigations naturally focus on the person responsible because understanding actions, motives, and decisions is necessary for justice. However, the historical importance of the Easter Sunday massacre also depends on remembering the victims. Their lives existed before the tragedy. They had families, relationships, personal histories, and futures that extended beyond the events of one afternoon. A complete understanding of the case requires recognizing those lives rather than allowing the offender's actions to become the only remembered aspect of the story. The legacy of the Easter Sunday massacre therefore exists in two separate but connected ways. It remains a significant criminal case because of the investigation, trial, and questions surrounding responsibility. At the same time, it remains a human tragedy because 11 people lost their lives during a family gathering that should have been a celebration. The importance of studying such cases is not to create fascination with violence, but to examine the factors that surround it and consider what lessons can be learned. Decades later, the tragedy continues to remind society that prevention requires attention to mental health, family relationships, social support, and responsible approaches to issues that can contribute to violence. Ultimately, the most enduring memory of the Easter Sunday massacre should not be the actions of the man who committed it, but the lives of those who were lost. Their absence represents the true measure of the tragedy. The case remains a reminder that behind every statistic, every courtroom document, and every historical account are real people whose lives mattered and whose stories deserve to be remembered with dignity and respect. The passage of time has transformed the Easter Sunday massacre from an immediate community tragedy into a case studied through the lenses of criminal justice, psychology, and social awareness. Yet despite decades of examination, the essential human reality of the event has remained unchanged. On March 30th, 1975, a family gathering in Hamilton, Ohio, ended with 11 people dead, leaving behind unanswered emotional questions that extended far beyond the courtroom. While investigators were able to establish the sequence of events and the legal system determined responsibility, understanding the deeper circumstances surrounding the massacre has remained a more complicated task. The case continues to demonstrate that some tragedies cannot be explained by a single cause or reduced to one simple answer. One of the reasons the case has remained significant is because it challenges common assumptions about violence. Many people imagine extreme crimes as events committed by obvious outsiders or individuals who are immediately recognizable as dangerous. The Easter Sunday massacre challenged that perception because the offender was not a stranger who entered the home. He was a family member who lived in the same residence and shared a personal history with the victims. This reality made the crime especially disturbing because the place that should have represented security became the location of unimaginable loss. The case forced communities to consider the difficult reality that violence can sometimes emerge within familiar relationships. In studying the events leading up to the massacre, researchers have often examined the role of accumulated grievances. According to evidence presented during the legal proceedings, James Urban Ruppert experienced years of dissatisfaction and resentment. He believed that he had been treated unfairly by members of his family, particularly in comparison with his brother Leonard. These perceptions appeared to have become deeply important in his thinking over time. However, investigators and experts also recognize that resentment alone does not explain such extreme violence. Millions of people experience family disagreements, disappointment, or feelings of unfairness without ever committing violent acts. The tragedy demonstrated how difficult it can be to identify the point at which personal frustration becomes a genuine danger. The case also remained relevant because of the discussion surrounding mental illness. During the trial, psychiatric experts examined Ruppert's psychological condition and offered different interpretations of his behavior and state of mind. The defense emphasized evidence of psychological disturbance, including paranoid beliefs and distorted perceptions of family relationships. Prosecutors focused on actions they argued demonstrated planning and awareness, including the preparation of multiple firearms and the organized manner of the attack. The disagreement between these perspectives reflected a broader debate that continues in criminal courts. How should society evaluate responsibility when severe mental illness and deliberate violence exist together? This question has no easy answer, and the Ruppert case became one example of the challenges faced by judges, juries, and mental health professionals. The aftermath of the massacre also contributed to greater attention toward the concept of family. Annihilation. Criminologists studying these crimes have attempted to identify common patterns among offenders, while acknowledging that no single profile applies to every case. Some offenders may experience financial collapse, relationship breakdown, humiliation, depression, substance abuse, or a sense of losing control over their lives. Others may have severe psychological disorders that influence their perceptions of reality. However, researchers emphasize that these circumstances do not inevitably lead to violence. The difficulty lies in understanding combinations of risk factors rather than searching for one. Universal explicación. The Easter Sunday massacre became a case frequently discussed because it involved several of these issues at once. Another lasting impact of the case involved the relationship between forensic science and criminal investigation. The tragedy occurred before many modern technological advances that are now common in homicide investigations. Yet detectives were still able to construct a detailed account through traditional methods. Careful documentation, ballistic analysis, medical examination, and witness interviews allowed investigators to determine what happened inside the residence. The investigation demonstrated that even in cases without surviving witnesses, physical evidence can reveal a great deal about a crime. It also showed the importance of maintaining objectivity in emotionally overwhelming situations. Investigators had to approach the scene professionally while recognizing the extraordinary human suffering represented by the evidence they collected. The criminal trial itself became an important examination of how the justice system handles cases involving overwhelming evidence and complex psychological questions. The identity of the offender was never seriously disputed, meaning the central conflict focused on responsibility rather than guilt. Jurors were asked to consider not only what James Ruppert had done, but also whether his mental condition affected his legal accountability. Their decision reflected the prosecution's argument that planning and purposeful behavior demonstrated responsibility despite psychological problems. The verdict represented the conclusion of the legal process, but it did not resolve every question about why the tragedy occurred. For the Hamilton community, the years following the massacre brought gradual movement forward, but remembrance remained important. Communities affected by major tragedies often face the challenge of honoring victims while continuing daily life. The Easter Sunday massacre became part of local history, remembered through the lives lost and the impact on those who survived. The passage of time can reduce public attention, but it does not erase the significance of what occurred for those personally connected to the victims. The case also serves as a reminder of the importance of focusing on victims when discussing true crime. Stories about notorious crimes often become centered around offenders because investigators must examine their actions and motivations. However, the purpose of studying such cases should not be to elevate the person responsible. The true importance lies in understanding the consequences of violence and remembering those whose lives were taken. The victims of the Easter Sunday massacre were parents, children, relatives, and members of a community. Their identities existed independently of the tragedy that ended their lives. As years passed, the case continued to appear in discussions of criminal psychology and homicide research, but its deepest meaning remained connected to loss. The event represented the destruction of a family and the lasting pain left behind for everyone who knew them. It demonstrated the limitations of prediction, the complexity of human behavior, and the need for continued attention to mental health, family support systems, and violence prevention. The Easter Sunday massacre remains a painful chapter in American criminal history not because it provides simple answers, but because it raises difficult questions that continue to challenge society. It reminds us that behind every investigation are real lives, real relationships, and real communities forever changed by tragedy. The responsibility of remembering such cases is not only to understand how violence happened, but also to recognize the value of the people who were lost and the importance of preventing similar suffering in the future. As the years continued to pass, the Easter Sunday massacre remained a case that represented one of the darkest examples of family violence in the United States. Its significance did not come only from the number of victims or the shocking circumstances of the crime, but from the difficult questions it raised about human behavior, family relationships, mental health, and the limits of prevention. Unlike many cases that fade from public memory because of unanswered questions, the Hamilton Massacre remained historically significant because it forced society to confront uncomfortable realities that had no simple solutions. The evidence established what happened inside the Minor Avenue residence, but understanding why it happened remained a far more complex challenge. The tragedy demonstrated that criminal investigations can often reconstruct actions with remarkable precision while still struggling to fully explain the thoughts and emotions behind those actions. For investigators, the physical evidence provided a clear timeline. James Urban Ruppert had access to multiple firearms, prepared them before the attack, entered the family gathering, and killed 11 relatives. The absence of another suspect, the ballistic evidence, and his surrender to police removed uncertainty regarding responsibility. Yet the deeper questions surrounding motive, psychological condition, and personal grievance continued to generate discussion among legal professionals and researchers. The case became an example of how knowing who committed a crime does not always mean society fully understands the circumstances that allowed it to occur. In the decades after the massacre, the study of family violence developed significantly. Researchers began examining patterns among offenders who commit violence against relatives, particularly cases where one individual destroys an entire family unit. These studies did not seek to excuse criminal behavior, but rather to identify possible contributing factors that might help prevent future tragedies. The Easter Sunday massacre was frequently considered within these broader discussions because it involved several issues often examined in family homicide cases: long-term resentment, isolation, substance abuse, psychological difficulties, and access to firearms. However, experts continued to emphasize that these elements are not automatic predictors of violence. Human behavior is complex, and there is no simple formula that can identify every person who may become dangerous. One important lesson from the case was the danger of ignoring serious emotional deterioration. According to testimony and investigation records, James Ruppert had experienced years of personal difficulties before the killings. He struggled with unemployment and alcohol use and developed deep feelings of resentment toward members of his family. Those around him recognized some of these problems, but the full extent of his anger and psychological instability was not understood before the massacre occurred. After the tragedy, many observers questioned whether intervention could have changed the outcome. However, answering that question with certainty is impossible. Retrospective analysis can identify warning signs, but it cannot prove that any specific intervention would have prevented a crime. This uncertainty remains one of the most difficult aspects of studying violent behavior. The case also contributed to continuing discussions about the role of mental health services. The trial demonstrated the challenges involved when psychiatric conditions become part of a criminal proceeding. Mental health experts may disagree about diagnosis, severity, and the effect of psychological disorders on decision-making. Courts must then evaluate that information according to legal standards rather than purely medical ones. The distinction between being mentally ill and being legally responsible remains fundamental in criminal law. The Easter Sunday massacre illustrated how complicated that distinction becomes when a defendant's actions appear both highly organized and potentially connected to severe psychological disturbance. The legal proceedings surrounding James Ruppert showed that the justice system must consider multiple realities at the same time. The victims and their families deserved accountability for the violence committed against them. At the same time, understanding the offender's mental condition was necessary for a complete legal evaluation. These two objectives are not mutually exclusive. Acknowledging psychological factors does not remove responsibility, and recognizing responsibility does not eliminate the importance of understanding contributing circumstances. This balance remains one of the greatest challenges in criminal justice. Beyond legal and psychological analysis, the case left a lasting impact on the community of Hamilton. Communities affected by mass violence often experience a collective sense of disbelief because such events challenge assumptions about safety and normal life. The Ruppert family home had been a place where relatives gathered, children celebrated holidays, and family routines took place. After the massacre, that same location became associated with tragedy. The emotional effect extended beyond those directly related to the victims because the entire community had to process an event that seemed impossible to comprehend. For neighbors and residents, the case became a reminder that appearances can sometimes hide serious struggles occurring behind closed doors. The massacre also reinforced the importance of remembering victims rather than allowing the offender to become the only focus of historical attention. In many famous criminal cases, public discussion can become centered on the person responsible, including their background and motivations. While understanding offenders may serve important purposes for research and prevention, the lives of victims must remain the primary consideration. The 11 people killed at the Ruppert residence had identities, relationships, and personal histories that existed long before the tragedy. They were not simply participants in a criminal case. They were individuals whose lives had meaning to their families, friends, and community. The continued study of the Easter Sunday massacre serves a purpose only when it respects that reality. The case remains relevant because it provides opportunities to examine difficult issues, but those examinations must always begin with recognition of the human cost. Over time, the tragedy became part of the historical record of major American crimes, but its importance extended beyond statistics and legal documents. It represented the devastating consequences of unresolved conflict, untreated psychological struggles, and access to deadly means of violence. It showed the importance of early recognition of serious problems while also demonstrating how difficult prevention can be. Society continues to search for better ways to support individuals experiencing crisis, strengthen mental health resources, and address situations where violence may become possible. Yet every discussion must acknowledge the limitations of prediction and the complexity of human Behavior. The Easter Sunday Massacre remains remembered because it represents both a specific historical event and a broader warning about the consequences of extreme violence within families. It is a story of loss, responsibility, investigation, and unanswered questions. The legal system provided a conclusion regarding accountability, but the emotional consequences endured far beyond the courtroom. The true legacy of the case is found not in the actions of the offender, but in the memory of those who were lost and in the continued effort to understand and prevent similar tragedies. Decades later, the Easter Sunday Massacre stands as a reminder that every act of violence leaves behind more than evidence and legal records. It leaves families changed forever, communities searching for answers, and a responsibility to remember the victims with dignity. The final chapter of the Easter Sunday Massacre is not defined by the actions of James Urban Ruppert, but by the lasting memory of the 11 people whose lives were taken and by the questions that remained after one of the most devastating family tragedies in American history. More than 4 decades after the events of March 30th, 1975, the case continues to be examined because it represents a painful intersection of personal conflict, psychological struggles, family relationships, and the devastating consequences of violence. The legal record provides a clear account of what happened, but the emotional and human impact of the tragedy continues to exist beyond court documents and investigative reports. The story of the Ruppert family remains a reminder that behind every major criminal case are real people whose lives had meaning long before tragedy placed them in history. The events that unfolded in Hamilton, Ohio, began as a family gathering during a traditional holiday. Easter Sunday was expected to be a time of connection and celebration, a day when relatives came together and shared familiar traditions. Instead, the gathering became one of the most shocking acts of family violence in the nation's history. The contrast between the purpose of the day and the horror that occurred inside the home remains one of the most haunting aspects of the case. A moment that should have represented unity became a moment of irreversible loss. The victims were not simply part of a crime scene or names in a legal file. They were family members with personal histories, relationships, and futures that ended suddenly. Leonard Ruppert Jr., Alma Ruppert, Charity Ruppert, and the 8 children represented the human cost of the tragedy. Their lives cannot be understood only through the circumstances of their deaths. They were individuals who existed within a family, a neighborhood, and a community before becoming connected to one of the most infamous crimes of the 1970s. Remembering them remains an essential part of understanding the case. The investigation into the massacre demonstrated the ability of law enforcement to reconstruct events even under the most difficult circumstances. Without surviving witnesses inside the home, investigators depended on careful forensic work. Ballistics examinations, crime scene analysis, medical reports, and witness statements combined to establish a detailed understanding of the attack. The investigation showed the importance of evidence-based conclusions rather than speculation. While the crime itself was emotionally overwhelming, investigators maintained focus on documenting facts and creating an accurate record of what occurred. Their work became the foundation for the legal proceedings that followed. The trial of James Urban Ruppert represented a different challenge. The central issue was not whether he had carried out the killings, but whether his mental condition affected his legal responsibility. The prosecution argued that his preparation, use of multiple firearms, and organized actions demonstrated deliberate intent. The defense argued that psychological problems influenced his understanding and behavior. The debate reflected one of the most difficult questions in criminal law. How should society respond when severe mental illness and extreme violence exist in the same case? The verdict established legal responsibility, but the broader discussion surrounding mental health and criminal accountability continued long afterward. The case also contributed to increased awareness of the complexities surrounding familicide. Researchers examining similar crimes have attempted to understand patterns that may appear before such tragedies occur. Factors such as isolation, resentment, financial problems, substance abuse, and psychological instability are often examined. However, experts consistently caution that these factors cannot predict violence on their own. Many people experience difficult circumstances without ever becoming violent. The challenge remains identifying situations where multiple warning signs may combine in a way that requires immediate attention and support. One of the enduring lessons from the Easter Sunday massacre is the importance of taking serious emotional and psychological struggles seriously. The case demonstrated how deeply held grievances and distorted perceptions can become dangerous when combined with other circumstances. At the same time, it also showed the difficulty of recognizing the point at which personal struggles may transform into a threat. Prevention remains one of the greatest challenges because human behavior cannot be predicted with absolute certainty. The tragedy continues to remind communities that support systems, mental health resources, and awareness of warning signs can play important roles in addressing crises before they escalate. Another lasting element of the case involves the responsibility of society to discuss violent crimes carefully and respectfully. True crime stories often attract attention because they involve shocking events and unusual circumstances. However, focusing only on the details of the offender's actions risks reducing victims to background figures. The most meaningful way to examine the Easter Sunday massacre is to recognize the lives lost and the impact their absence created. The purpose of studying such tragedies should be understanding, prevention, and remembrance, not fascination with violence itself. The case remains historically significant because it raises questions that continue to exist today. How can communities better recognize individuals in crisis? How can mental health concerns be addressed before they become dangerous? How should legal systems evaluate responsibility when psychological disorders are involved? These questions do not have simple answers, but examining cases like the Easter Sunday massacre allows society to continue searching for better solutions. The tragedy serves as both a historical event and a warning about the importance of compassion, awareness, and intervention. In the end, the legacy of the Easter Sunday massacre belongs to the victims and the lessons learned from their loss. James Urban Ruppert's actions created a tragedy that changed countless lives. But the meaning of the case should not be limited to the person responsible. The greater responsibility is remembering those who were killed, recognizing the suffering experienced by those left behind, and understanding the circumstances that surrounded the crime. The passage of time may reduce public attention, but it does not reduce the significance of the lives that were lost. The 11 victims remain the central figures of this story. Their memory represents the importance of looking beyond the violence itself and remembering the people whose lives were taken. The Easter Sunday massacre remains one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. But its final lesson is not about destruction. It is about the need to understand, to remember, and to continue searching for ways to prevent similar tragedies from happening again.